Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dig deeper into a problem that's been brewing for years, one that most people only notice in the loud moments: market crashes, political standoffs, frantic headlines, but rarely in the quiet, early signals that matter the most. I'm sitting here in my office, the screen's flickering with late evening market data, and I'm watching something unusual happening beneath the surface of the US economy. It isn't dramatic enough to wake most people up yet, but it's steady, persistent, and structurally important. I can feel the tension the same way you sense a storm shifting the air before you hear the thunder. And as I look at these patterns again, I'm reminded that you probably won't make it through this cycle if you don't understand it. Right now, I'm seeing the early outlines of what I call a silent debt spiral. It's not the explosive kind that hits suddenly and wipes out banks. It's the quieter, more insidious version that tightens slowly over time, the kind policymakers tend not to see until the pressure becomes unavoidable. If you're sitting somewhere in a quiet living room, or maybe listening from a crowded subway, remember this isn't just theory. This is a cycle that affects your job, your savings, the price of everything around you, and the stability of the world you're living in. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to watch the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Debt in an economy behaves like gravity. You don't feel it until it reaches a point where it changes movement. And right now, I'm noticing distortions in how money is flowing across sectors. Household debt edging higher than income growth, corporate refinancing stacking up at higher rates, and state budgets quietly bending under obligations they accumulated back when interest rates were near zero. These are subtle cracks, not loud fractures, which is why they're dangerous. A loud crisis forces action. A silent one evolves until choices narrow. I glance again at the long-term debt cycle chart I've looked at for decades. It always amazes me how similar patterns repeat, even across completely different eras. People still debate whether these repeating structures are inevitable or simply the result of human behavior failing to change, but I've watched enough cycles to suspect the answer might be both. What matters now is recognizing we're in another build-up phase where debt grows faster than productivity and interest costs start rising at a pace that outstrips the benefits borrowed money was supposed to create. A mainstream macroeconomic fact is playing out right in front of us. When rates rise after a long period of being artificially low, existing debt becomes heavier, not just mathematically, but behaviorally. Borrowers become cautious, lenders look more closely, and spending slows before anyone officially declares a slowdown. It's like watching dimmer lights fade across a city from an airplane at night. You don't know which neighborhood loses power next, but you can sense the pattern forming. That's where we are right now, quiet dimming. And as always, there's a strange corner of economic history reminding me that none of this is new. In medieval Europe, there was a ritual called debt purging, where lords would ceremonially burn records to restart loyalty and stabilize local economies. It sounds theatrical, almost ridiculous, but the underlying idea was simple. Excess obligations eventually suffocate the system. We don't burn ledgers today, but we do restructure, inflate, renegotiate, or politically battle over who bears the cost. The method changes, the constraint does not. Tonight, as I trace through the numbers, a slightly kinked yield curve here, a slowdown in small business credit there, a subtle shift in Treasury auction demand, I feel the pattern familiar from earlier eras. The early stage of the silent tightening isn't about collapse. It's about compression. Everything gets a little harder, a little tighter, a little more strained, but not enough for headlines. It's the type of moment where households feel something is off before economists admit it. The rent rises a little faster than wages. The credit card balance doesn't come down as easily. The corporate CEO trims hiring quietly instead of announcing layoffs. The state government delays a project without explanation. Small things widely spread. And as I sit with this data, I'm noticing something else, a change in sentiment among the lenders themselves. Banks are becoming more selective, not dramatically, but consistently. It's subtle, the way a river narrows before a waterfall. They're asking more questions, trimming approvals, reevaluating collateral, and raising minimum scores. That alone doesn't signal collapse, but it does signal direction. In debt cycles, direction is almost always more important than headlines. Remember that yield curve kinking earlier? It wasn't dramatic, but it was telling. A kink is the market whispering, something doesn't add up. And each time I see that whisper, paired with rising interest burdens, slowing real growth, and higher refinancing walls, I know the silent phase of the debt spiral is deepening. People still debate whether the U.S. can grow out of its obligations, inflate them away, or restructure through political compromise. What they underestimate is timing. You can use any of those strategies, but you can't choose when the cycle forces your hand. That part is always dictated by math and sentiment, two forces that don't negotiate. As I watch the late night markets move in small but meaningful ways, I feel the same quiet tension I've seen before every major turning point. 1,970 seconds inflation, 1,980 seconds rate shock, 2008's credit freeze. Each one started silently before it became loud, and tonight I'm watching the silence again.
Now, let's get to tonight's analysis.
I'm watching credit conditions tighten in ways that feel strangely familiar, almost like the early stages of a long, slow exhale across the entire economy. As I sit here, the room is quiet except for the faint hum of the monitors displaying lending spreads, commercial loan demand, and bank reserve adjustments. The numbers aren't dramatic on their own, but they move with a rhythm I've learned to recognize. Credit is narrowing quietly and steadily, and that's usually the second stage of a tightening spiral that most people don't feel until it's already shaped their outcomes. Right now, lenders across the country are pulling back, not by slamming the door, but by nudging it more closed every month. Banks don't announce this, they rarely do. Instead, they adjust standards. A higher credit score requirement here, a stricter income verification there, a slightly lower approval rate on small business loans. It's like watching a valve twist slowly. The flow reduces, not all at once, but in increments that accumulate. And those increments matter more than any headline. They're the heartbeat of the economy, and tonight that heartbeat is a bit more faint. I can almost picture someone sitting at home, maybe flipping between bills at the kitchen table, wondering why their credit card rate jumped again or why the car loan they expected to qualify for suddenly required a cosigner. These aren't random inconveniences, they're signals. They're how tightening begins, not through a dramatic collapse, but through thousands of small rejections that never get talked about. And yet, they add up to something systemic. One mainstream macroeconomic fact stands out right now. Credit cycles turn before economic cycles do. Lending standards tighten before job losses rise. Approvals fall before defaults climb. The pipeline constricts before GDP reacts. And because we've just moved out of one of the most aggressively loose credit periods in modern history, zero rates, stimulus surges,
Refinancing booms. The shift feels sharper beneath the surface than it appears in the news. The system is recalibrating, but not gently.
There's an old, almost absurd anecdote from the Roman Empire that comes to mind.
During certain debt crises, lenders insisted on physically inspecting borrowers' homes before issuing loans, not because the home mattered as collateral, but because it allowed them to inspect lifestyle.
They wanted to confirm that borrowers lived modestly, believing modest living signaled moral reliability. It sounds comical now, intrusive even, but the underlying impulse hasn't disappeared. Lenders still look for behavioral cues. They've just digitized the process. They track credit utilization patterns, savings consistency, and purchase habits.
The tools change, but the tension between lender caution and borrower need remains timeless.
As I scroll through a chart showing declining demand for commercial and industrial loans, I feel that quiet tightening in the air.
It's similar to what I saw before. The dot-com downturn, credit wasn't collapsing, but it was thinning. And people still debate whether the slowdown that followed was inevitable or simply the result of poor sentiment feeding on itself. But cycles rarely hinge on one thing.
They're a sequence of reinforcing feedbacks, and credit conditions are one of the earliest and strongest.
Tonight, the markets are calm, almost eerily so. Futures drifting slightly, bond yields hovering, currency spreads barely moving. But under that calm,
is a behavioral shift. Households are taking on more high-interest credit because they have fewer alternatives. Corporations are refinancing at rates 2 or even 3 times higher than their previous obligations. Local governments are delaying infrastructure projects because borrowing for them is suddenly more expensive. Each of these decisions is rational on its own, but collectively they create a pattern of contraction. As I think back on earlier decades, the buildup always had this same feel. Before the 1,970 seconds inflation spike became obvious, lending narrowed quietly. Before the 2008 financial crisis, credit availability shrank long before the official recession began. The signs weren't dramatic then either, just like today. The calm before tightening is deceptive. You don't feel a debt spiral through crashing numbers, you feel it through slowing motion. Less borrowing, less risk-taking, less investment, less liquidity. It's like the economy inhales sharply and holds its breath. I keep noticing the same subtle indicators. Small business credit delinquencies rising slightly, banks increasing capital buffers, consumers dipping into savings at a faster pace. It's a constellation of small adjustments that form a larger picture. We're moving from expansion to caution. Remember that dimming effect I mentioned earlier? This is the same idea but spread through credit channels. A restaurant owner postpones expansion. A young family decides to rent for another year instead of buying a house. A manufacturer delays equipment upgrades. These aren't collapses, they're hesitations. And widespread hesitation has the power to reshape the cycle more strongly than panic does. There's another odd historical detail I keep coming back to. In ancient Mesopotamia, debt relief was granted not during collapse, but during stagnation. Kings issued clean slates precisely when the system became too sluggish to sustain itself. They understood something we often forget. A tightening spiral is most dangerous when it's silent, not when it's loud. And here we are feeling that silence again. As I keep analyzing these flows, the tightening isn't just visible in numbers, it's felt in the mood of the system. Investors are more cautious, borrowers more defensive, lenders more selective. The economy is shifting from ease to restraint, and the shift is accelerating. People still debate whether this transition is necessary, whether higher rates will discipline the excess or simply compress the middle class further. But either way, the transition is happening, and credit, the lifeblood of the economy, is circulating more slowly tonight. I'm watching the cycle reveal itself piece by piece, the way a drawing gradually emerges when you shade lightly along its edges. Nothing dramatic has happened yet, no sudden crash, no political standoff, no emergency rate cut, but the deeper structural imbalances are becoming visible if you know where to look. I'm here in the same dim room, the screens casting their pale glow across the desk. And as I scan the latest refinancing data and Treasury issuance schedules, I can feel the pressure gathering beneath the surface more distinctly than before. What I'm seeing tonight is something many people overlook. The moment when rising interest costs expose truths that low rates concealed. When money is cheap, almost any structure stands. But as costs climb, the weak foundations reveal themselves. And right now, those rising interest expenses are moving through the economy like water seeping into the cracks of a frozen lake. At first, it's silent. Then it becomes patterns. Eventually, it becomes fractures. In the present tense, I'm watching companies that previously refinanced at 2% now facing 6% or 7%. Households rolling over debt at twice the interest they used to pay. Governments issuing bonds whose servicing costs consume a larger share of their budgets. These aren't isolated incidents, they're a reflection of the same core reality. When rates rise after a long suppression, debt burdens expand faster than incomes, faster than revenues, faster than political capacity. It's the classic middle stage of the long-term debt cycle, and it always feels uncomfortable because it forces choices people don't want to make yet. And here's the mainstream macroeconomic fact I'm reminding myself of. Interest expense grows exponentially faster in the late phase of a debt buildup. Even small changes in rates ripple across trillions of dollars. Tonight, that ripple is becoming a wave. There's a strange historical practice I can't help recalling while I track these numbers. In ancient China, Officials sometimes adjusted tax obligations based on the phase of the lunar cycle. They believe certain phases increase people's willingness to comply. It sounds mystical now, almost humorous, but the underlying idea is similar to what we're experiencing today. Human behavior shifts with context, not with logic. When interest rates stayed low for years, people naturally borrowed more. When rates rise suddenly, they don't immediately stop, they adapt, hesitantly, inconsistently, emotionally. Systems respond with lag, not symmetry. As I scroll through data showing rising debt service to income ratios across several income groups, I feel the imbalance becoming clearer. These numbers might look small to someone viewing them casually, an extra 2 percentage points here, a small refinancing bump there, but when multiplied across an entire economy, they become gravitational. They change the motion of everything: spending, investment, hiring, production, even national strategy. People still debate whether this stage of the cycle has to lead to contraction or whether innovation, immigration, or productivity gains can offset the rising burden. I'm always open to those possibilities, but the cycle doesn't rely on optimism, it relies on math. And math is beginning to twist in a direction that's hard to ignore. As I examine the corporate bond market, I notice the maturity walls clustering closer together. Companies that extended debt maturities in 2020 and 2021 are now approaching the window where they need to roll that debt over at significantly higher costs. It's not a crisis yet, but it's an exposure. And exposure is where cycles turn. At the same time, I'm watching the federal government's interest expenses rise so fast that they outpace entire budget categories. You don't need a crisis to create stress, just a gradual repricing of debt. That's what we're living through right now, a repricing event, not a meltdown. But repricing events are what set the tone for the next decade. I lean back in my chair for a moment, letting the quiet settle. Outside my window, the city looks calm, the lights steady, but internally, the system is tightening. Not with panic, but with inevitability. And as I shift my attention to consumer spending metrics, I see the other side of this pressure. Households are still spending, but they're spending differently. They're prioritizing essentials, leaning more on credit, less on savings. It's a behavioral shift that always follows rising debt burdens. It's subtle, but it's real. There's a soft hum from the air conditioner, blending with the flicker of the charts updating in real time. The S&P futures inching sideways, Treasury yields inching upward, currency volatility gently rising. Everything is still moving, but with tension. Remember that earlier tightening in bank lending standards? This section is where that tightening interacts with rising interest costs and reveals the deeper cycle. Borrowers who once thrived under low costs now struggle. Institutions reliant on cheap debt begin trimming. Governments start debating budgets more urgently. These reactions are predictable, not because anyone wants them, but because debt cycles function like tides. Another odd historical note drifts into my mind. In 18th century Venice, merchants recorded debts using color-coded inks, black for manageable obligations, red for unstable ones, and gold for debts backed by noble families. The interesting part wasn't the colors, it was how quickly entries shifted from black to red when interest charges increased. Human systems haven't evolved as much as we like to believe. Today, our red ink simply takes the form of widening spreads, lower ratings, higher refinancing risk. As I return to the present moment, I feel the pattern solidifying. The debt cycle isn't just tightening, it's revealing. It's showing which sectors are fragile, which households are overstretched, which companies were relying too much on cheap leverage. The quiet part is ending. The visible stage is beginning. And the most dangerous thing is that the cycle isn't dramatic yet. It's just clear. I'm feeling the pressure building underneath now, deeper, heavier, more layered than what we've walked through so far. The tightening isn't just happening through credit conditions or rising interest burdens anymore. It's moving through the hidden architecture of the economy, the parts most people never think about until something cracks. As I sit here, the room dim and quiet, the screens casting their soft glow around me,
I can almost sense the weight of obligations pushing outward from the shadows of balance sheets across the country. What's happening tonight is subtle but unmistakable. Leverage that once looked harmless under near zero rates is now revealing its true structure. I'm watching off-balance sheet commitments, private credit exposures, municipal liabilities, and corporate lease obligations shift from being background noise to becoming meaningful risk focuses. And the more I follow these threads, the more I feel the tightening spiral pulling inward. One mainstream macroeconomic fact stands out right now. During periods of rising rates, hidden leverage emerges faster than visible leverage. That truth alone is shaping what I'm seeing. Obligations that were easy to ignore when interest costs were negligible now require attention, urgent attention. An adjusted lease cost here, a refinanced bond there, a private credit facility rolling over at double its previous rate. None of these events are dramatic on their own, but together they form the silent skeleton of the tightening debt spiral. And there's an odd historical parallel that comes to mind. In Ottoman markets, merchants once maintained shadow ledgers where informal debts were recorded outside the legal system. These shadow accounts were widely understood to be the true measure of economic health, not the official registers. Strangely enough, modern economies haven't abandoned the practice. We've just digitized the shadows. Today, private credit markets, derivatives, exposures, contingent liabilities, and pension obligations play the role of those shadow ledgers. They don't show up in headlines, but they matter profoundly. I'm looking now at a chart that breaks down the growth of private credit over the last decade. It's staggering how quickly it expanded in the background, doubling and then doubling again, while public markets absorbed most of the attention. And people still debate whether private credit's rise is stabilizing or destabilizing. On one hand, it diversifies funding sources. On the other, it hides risk. Tonight, the latter feels more relevant. Private credit thrives in silence, but debt spirals don't. They eventually pull everything into the open. As I track through corporate filings and municipal forecasts, I see the same dynamic repeating. Exposures quietly increasing while revenues flatten. A mid-sized city relying on higher property taxes to cover pension costs. A regional hospital system rolling debt forward at triple the old coupon rate. A manufacturing firm stuck with a refinancing wall that arrived sooner than modeled because earnings slowed. These are the hidden layers of pressure layers that don't break instantly but compress relentlessly. The political dimension is also shifting. Legislatures at both the state and federal level are starting to feel the tension between growing obligations and shrinking fiscal space. The debates are louder, more polarized, less patient. And that's another point in the cycle. When the math tightens, the politics tighten faster. I can sense it in the tone of policy discussions, in the hesitation to commit to long-term spending, in the discomfort around entitlement reform. Debt spirals aren't just economic, they're socio-political.
Tonight, the markets feel eerily calm again, but I've learned over the decades that calm markets during periods of rising structural pressure are like deep waters hiding strong undercurrents.
The surface is peaceful, but the movement below is powerful. Treasury yields shift just a little, corporate spreads widen just a little, commodity prices drift. Nothing screams danger, but everything points the same direction.
Remember the earlier signs, the credit tightening, the refinancing walls, the dimming sentiment? Now they're intersecting with hidden leverage.
This is the moment in the cycle where the pressure stops being conceptual and becomes mechanical. Costs go up, capacity goes down, and the system feels heavier.
There's another strange economic tradition that surfaces in my mind. In ancient Japan, certain domains imposed rice-denominated debt resets after poor harvests.
The logic was simple. When the underlying productive base weakened, debt obligations adjusted. Today, we rarely adjust obligations. We just shift the pressure. We raise taxes. We cut spending. We inflate. We restructure. But the root issue, overextension, remains. As I look across the private credit market, the public pension space, the real estate refinancing pipeline, and the municipal funding gaps, I see the same pattern tightening like a coil. Obligations rising faster than income, not dramatically, just consistently. And consistent pressure is more dangerous than sudden shocks.
People still debate whether the U.S. can outgrow this pressure through innovation or whether the spiral will force painful adjustments. But the cycle isn't waiting for that debate. It's already tightening.
Slowly, quietly, predictably. The pressure isn't explosive yet, but it is building. And tonight, I'm watching it gather in layers that are too interconnected to ignore. I'm sensing the signals of structural fatigue more clearly now, as if the economy itself is exhaling slower and with more effort. There's a heaviness in the data, a weight that's not tied to a single crisis or event, but to the long-term forces that accumulate beneath the surface. When I look around the room, the muted lights, the quiet hum of the screens, the late-night stillness outside my window, I feel the same atmosphere I've felt before, major inflection points in past cycles, not panic.
Not chaos, just a steady, unmistakable strain.
What's surfacing now are the deeper structural factors that amplify any tightening debt. Spiral demographic shifts, weakening productivity growth, geopolitical fragmentation, and eroding alliances. These aren't new trends, but what makes this moment unusual is how they're converging with the rising cost of debt.
When structural stagnation meets financial tightening, the system doesn't break immediately. It becomes sluggish, unresponsive, and tense. And that's exactly where the U.S.
economy is drifting tonight. Let me start with demographics, because they shape the long-term trajectory more than almost any other factor.
A mainstream macroeconomic fact is that economic growth is the sum of productivity growth and labor force expansion. And right now, labor force expansion is stagnating. Birth rates are falling.
Immigration flows are uncertain. Retirements are accelerating.
This means fewer workers supporting more obligations, public pensions, healthcare needs, long-term state liabilities, just as debt servicing costs rise.
It's a slow-motion squeeze, the kind people don't feel until it affects taxes, benefits, and public services. There's an odd historical pattern that pops into my mind. In certain Nordic societies centuries ago, aging population clusters would prompt temporary tax relief for younger households to encourage childbearing and strengthen the economic base.
Today, we debate tax credits, child care subsidies, and immigration policy, but the underlying idea is the same. When demographics weaken, the economic foundation strains. And in the U.S.,
that strain is growing more noticeable every year.
As I watch productivity numbers tonight, flickering on the screen in muted blues and greens, I see the second piece of structural fatigue. Productivity gains have slowed significantly compared to earlier decades. People still debate whether the digital age should have unlocked far higher productivity or whether we've reached a natural plateau. But either way, stagnation in productivity makes debt burdens heavier. When output doesn't grow fast enough, obligations become harder to service. It's like walking with a backpack that gains a pound of weight each mile. Eventually, you feel it.
Alongside demographics and productivity, geopolitical fragmentation is shifting the global landscape. Supply chains are reconfiguring. Alliances are being tested. And global trust, one of the most underrated economic forces, is weakening. This matters because the stability of the U.S. dollar system, the availability of cheap imports, the predictability of military alliances, and the willingness of foreign governments to hold U.S. debt all rely on trust. Now, that trust is more conditional. And there's another historical curiosity I can't help recalling. During the late period Roman Empire, provinces grew increasingly reluctant to send grain and taxes to the center, not out of rebellion, but out of the simple belief that the empire's stability was no longer guaranteed. When confidence slips even slightly, systems shift. Today, we don't ship grain to Washington, but we do ship capital, bonds, investments, strategic resources. And when global confidence hesitates, the entire structure wobbles. As the data updates, I notice the subtle signs of weakening alliances reflected in trade flows and currency movements, countries hedging by diversifying foreign reserves, multinationals relocating production to multiple regions instead of relying on one. It's not a crisis, it's a rearrangement. And rearrangements increase costs, reduce efficiency, and create friction just when debt burdens make friction expensive. Remember earlier when we talked about tightening credit and rising interest costs? Here's where structural fatigue intersects with both.
When demographics weaken, productivity slows, and geopolitical tensions rise, the economy becomes less resilient to financial tightening. It's like the system is running uphill with heavier shoes. Everything takes more effort. Every adjustment becomes more painful. And then there's internal political fragmentation, a force that makes all other pressures harder to address. Policymakers today struggle to reach consensus even on routine matters. The fiscal debates grow sharper, the rhetoric grows hotter, and the willingness to compromise shrinks. I've watched this pattern before in other countries at similar stages of the debt cycle. As obligations rise and resources tighten, internal politics become more polarized, not less. There's a fringe economic insight that fits here. In medieval England, the severity of winter feuds correlated strongly with food supplies from prior harvests. Scarcity created conflict. Surplus created cooperation. Today, scarcity takes the form of fiscal constraints rather than grain stocks, but the behavioral pattern remains eerily similar. As I reflect on all these layers, demographics, productivity, global trust, political polarization, I feel the structural fatigue accumulating like sediment. Nothing catastrophic, nothing sudden, but noticeable, persistent, heavy. People still debate whether technological breakthroughs can counteract these forces or whether demographic decline can be reversed through policy. I hope so. Innovation has surprised us before. But cycles don't wait for optimism. They respond to conditions. And tonight, the conditions are telling a clear story. The economy is tiring at the worst possible moment in the debt cycle. The tightening is no longer just financial, it's structural. And structural tightening is the kind that reshapes decades, not years. I'm noticing the system beginning to react now slowly, cautiously, and in ways that suggest the tightening spiral is no longer just theoretical. It's moving through markets, through policymakers' decisions, and through the quiet behavioral shifts of millions of individuals. As I sit here with the same soft hum from the monitors, the charts updating in their calm, steady rhythm, it feels like watching an orchestra tuning before a performance. The music hasn't begun, but every instrument is adjusting, preparing, aligning, and those adjustments matter. Market reactions always start subtly. I'm seeing Treasury yields rising not in sharp jumps, but in firm, persistent steps. Corporate spreads are widening just enough to signal discomfort, not panic, but unease. The dollar strengthens against some currencies and weakens against others, reflecting a global environment struggling to recalibrate. When I watch these movements in real time, I feel the tension building behind each one, the way pressure builds in a spring before it releases. A mainstream macroeconomic fact stands out right now. Financial markets respond not to what's happening, but to what they sense is about to happen. And tonight, they're sensing strain. Investors are seeking safety, shifting portfolios toward shorter maturities, safer credits, and more liquid assets. Corporations are revising earnings forecasts downward, citing higher financing costs. Households are reducing discretionary spending. Each response is small on its own, but collectively they're shaping a new trajectory. There's an odd historical insight that pops into my mind as I watch this unfold. In some ancient Athenian city-states, merchants used to track market sentiment by observing how crowded the agora became. A bustling marketplace meant economic confidence. A quiet one meant caution. Today, we measure crowding through volatility indices, liquidity gauges, and options markets, but the underlying behavior hasn't changed. Confidence fills a market with activity. Fear empties it. And tonight, the digital agora feels less crowded than it did a year ago. As I shift through the data, I notice patterns emerging. Equity markets drifting sideways with low conviction. Bond markets signaling stress even when stocks look calm. Commodities holding their breath, waiting for direction. These are the early signals that the system is beginning to internalize the tightening spiral. The cycle is moving from hidden pressure to active adjustment. Policymakers, too, are reacting, though often reluctantly. The Federal Reserve is trying to balance inflation control with financial stability, a notoriously difficult task during a debt tightening.
Legislators are debating spending priorities with growing urgency. State governments are revising budgets. These reactions aren't loud or dramatic. They're procedural, incremental, and deeply revealing. They tell me that the math is tightening faster than the politics can adapt. And here's where things get more intricate. The global system is reacting as well. Foreign central banks adjusting reserve allocations, trade partners reviewing risk exposures, investors reassessing the reliability of the U.S. fiscal path. For decades, the world relied on American financial stability as its anchor. But anchors shift when weight increases. And tonight, that shift is visible in the subtle rebalancing of global capital flows. As I lean closer to the screen, examining currency trends, I notice the gradual diversification of reserves away from the dollar, not in dramatic exits, but in cautious reallocations. People still debate whether the dollar's dominance will endure or erode. I've always argued that dollar cycles follow geopolitical cycles, not just economic ones. And right now, that geopolitical cycle is undergoing stress. Back inside the U.S., corporate America is starting to adjust. Companies are delaying expansions. CFOs are issuing cautionary notes. Boards are discussing cost containment. It's not crisis behavior, it's caution behavior. And caution, when applied broadly, has the power to slow an economy more effectively than any single policy. Households, too, are shifting behavior, increasing savings slightly, reducing discretionary travel, delaying big-ticket purchases. I can almost picture someone staring at their monthly budget, feeling the quiet pinch of higher interest payments. It's the same reaction I've seen in countless cycles. When debt burdens rise, people tighten without being told to tighten. Remember that earlier pressure from hidden leverage, from private credit obligations, and from weak productivity? This section is where all of those pressures interact with market behavior. It's the moment when tightening transitions from being a largely mathematical problem to a behavioral one. System reactions amplify structural weaknesses. Market psychology reinforces financial fragility. It's a feedback loop, quiet but powerful. There's another historical tradition that comes to mind. In 14th century Florence, during periods of economic strain, merchants carried small silver coins known as testoni to assess counterparty trust. The idea was simple, small, discrete tests to gauge stability. Today's version is the rise of credit default swaps, liquidity preference signals, and yield curve distortions. Different tools, same instinct. As I track the widening gap between short-term and long-term expectations, I feel the tightening spiral reaching another phase. Not a break, not a crisis, but a shift. The system is responding, adjusting, recalibrating under pressure. People still debate whether policymakers can engineer a soft landing or whether the cycle will force a harder adjustment. I'm hopeful for balance, but I know the cycle well enough to see the direction. And tonight, the direction is unmistakable. The system is reacting and the spiral is tightening into its next stage. I'm watching the economy approach its inevitable turning point, the moment in the cycle where the silent pressure of the debt spiral becomes something you can no longer ignore. It's late again, the quiet hours when the world slows down enough for patterns to become sharp, and the glow from the screens reflects that same familiar rhythm I've seen in every major transition. Steady, heavy, unmistakable. The data coming in tonight doesn't scream crisis, but it whispers inevitability. And in debt cycles, whispers are often far more telling than shouts. This stage of the cycle is where all the earlier elements, tightening credit, rising interest costs, hidden leverage, structural fatigue, market reactions intersect and compound. Nothing is collapsing yet, but everything is stressed. Households are strained. Corporations are stretched. Governments are negotiating with time rather than strategy. Markets are waiting for clarity they won't get. And through it all, the cost of carrying the past is rising faster than the capacity to generate the future. A mainstream macroeconomic fact stands at the center of this moment. Long-term debt cycles turn not when debt is highest, but when the ability to service that debt becomes fragile. It's the fragility that signals the shift, not the absolute number.
Tonight, that fragility is spreading across multiple sectors. Debt service ratios rising, delinquency rates inching upward, corporate refinancing accelerating, municipal obligations widening, everything moving in the same direction, but quietly. As I scan the numbers, an odd historical memory surfaces back in the early 17th century. Certain Dutch towns created sleeping taxes, obligations that only activated when economic stress became unbearable. They weren't meant to be paid, they were meant to signal when the cycle was nearing its breaking point. We don't use sleeping taxes anymore, but we do have sleeping indicators, yield curve inversions, liquidity gaps, declining foreign demand at bond auctions. These signals were quiet months ago. Now they're awake. In the present tense, I'm watching the government's interest expense chart slope upward with a steepness that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. I'm seeing households dipping into savings that were supposed to be buffers. I'm watching companies redraw cash flow projections that no longer accommodate rising borrowing costs. These shifts aren't speculative, they're mechanical, and mechanical patterns are the deepest form of inevitability in economics. People still debate whether innovation will save us, or whether productivity can surge just in time to ease the pressure, or whether geopolitical détente could stabilize global conditions. I hope these things happen. I always root for solutions. But cycles aren't built on hope, they're built on the accumulation of actions and the constraints those actions produce. Hope can influence sentiment, but it cannot rewrite math. Tonight, I noticed something else. The political atmosphere has sharpened. Fiscal debates have become more urgent. Policy proposals more reactionary. At both federal and state levels, lawmakers are confronting rising debt service costs that cannibalize other priorities. They're discovering what every system discovers at this stage of the cycle. Choices shrink as obligations expand. A dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on anything else. And as the debt spiral tightens, those choices become more difficult. Corporate behavior is shifting too. Firms are cutting marginal projects, freezing hiring, reevaluating expansions, not because they're failing, but because the risk calculus has changed. When the cost of debt rises, the value of caution rises with it. And as caution spreads, economic motion slows. Households feel the turn in subtle, emotional ways. You can almost picture someone at the kitchen table staring at bills, recalculating monthly payments, feeling the pinch of rising interest costs. These micro moments accumulate into macro realities. They always have. Remember earlier when we talked about the dimming sentiment, the tightening lending standards, the rising servicing burdens, the structural fatigue? This is where all of those forces converge. And convergence, not collapse, is what turns a cycle. There's a strange historical practice from the ancient Near East that fits this stage well. During certain debt crises, rulers declared jubilees, resetting obligations to restore balance when the system became too constricted to function. We don't have jubilees today, at least not explicitly, but we do have restructurings, inflation, political standoffs, central bank interventions, different tools, same purpose, to ease the chokehold of accumulated obligations. As I continue examining the data flows and market reactions, I see the same pattern repeating that I've witnessed over decades. The system reaches a point where continuing along the same trajectory is no longer feasible. It doesn't mean collapse. It doesn't mean apocalypse. It means adjustment. Sometimes painful, sometimes messy, sometimes transformative, but adjustment nonetheless. This is the turning point, the moment when the spiral becomes visible to everyone, not just to those watching the screens at 2 a.m. And once it becomes visible, reactions accelerate. Investors hedge, households conserve, businesses postpone. Policymakers debate, markets jitter, the spiral tightens, and then the real choices begin. Now the question becomes, how will the system adapt? Through inflation, through austerity, through growth breakthroughs, through political compromise, through quiet restructuring? There are many paths. People still debate which one is best, which one is possible, which one is inevitable.
But the cycle doesn't answer those debates. It simply presents the bill. And tonight, I can feel that bill arriving. I'm slowing down now, letting the numbers fade from the screens and the tension drain from the room. After walking through each layer of this tightening spiral, it feels important to end not with urgency, but with clarity and maybe even a little calm. These cycles have unfolded many times throughout history, and as heavy as this moment feels, it isn't unfamiliar. The weight of obligations, the strain on households, the cautious markets, the political friction, these pressures come and go like tides. And just like tides, they recede eventually. As I sit here reflecting, I'm reminded that every major economic cycle has a point where fear peaks, but awareness deepens. And awareness has a way of softening the edges. When we understand what's happening, truly understand it, the unknown becomes less frightening. We stop reacting blindly. We start preparing thoughtfully. We shift from panic to perspective. And perspective is the closest thing to stability during uncertain times. The debt spiral tightening beneath the U.S. economy isn't the end of the story. It's a phase, a challenging one, yes, but still just a phase. Systems adapt, people adapt, innovations arise at unexpected moments. Policymakers, even when late, eventually respond. And economies have a remarkable capacity to heal once the excesses are worked through. You've probably felt the heaviness of this cycle building around you, higher costs, slower motion, a quieter sense of strain, but cycles always turn, they always have. As you drift away from tonight's analysis, let the complexity blur just a bit. Let the charts fade into impression instead of detail. And let yourself settle into the understanding that being aware already puts you ahead of the cycle. Whatever comes next, adjustments, recovery, renewal, you're more prepared than most. Thank you for staying with me tonight, for listening, for thinking deeply, and for supporting this work. Your presence makes these late night reflections worth sharing. Sleep well, stay steady, and I'll see you in the next analysis.